Good morning, and welcome to this public meeting of the United States Consumer Product Safety Commission. This morning we have two items on the agenda. Our first item is prohibition of children's toys and child care articles containing specified phthalates, the final rule. And the second item is revision to the notice of requirements for prohibitions of children's toys and child care articles containing specified phthalates, notice of proposed rulemaking. We have two staff members with us here this morning in case there are any additional questions from our staff. We have Dr. Michael Babich, who is the Director of Division of Toxicology and Risk Assessment, and Mr. David DiMatteo from the Office of General Counsel. Thank you both for being here. And I know that I speak on behalf of all of my colleagues. This has been a huge lift for the agency, and so many people have been involved in this, all of the work that's gone into this final rule. And so I just want to make sure I express all of our appreciation to all of you. We will begin with questions for staff. Each commissioner will have 5 minutes for questions, and we can go multiple rounds if necessary. Following the questions for staff, we will then turn to the consideration of the final rule. So I will begin with questions, and I do not have any additional questions this morning. Commissioner Adler?
I'm sure to the delight of staff, I have no questions.
Commissioner Robinson?
I would just also like to thank you very much, and thank you for answering questions in the last few days, and I have no further questions.
Thank you. Commissioner Kay?
No questions. Thank you again to Dr. Babich, Mr. DiMatteo, and the rest of the group. I'm sure this is a giant monkey off your back.
And Commissioner Mohorovic?
Thank you, Chairman. I also have no questions, and thank you and congratulations on all the hard work.
Having heard no further questions this morning, staff is excused from the table, and I'm sure you'll hear a collective sigh of relief. Thank you both very much again for being here. We will now consider any amendments or motions. Does anyone have any amendments or motions here this morning?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment.
Thank you. Commissioner Kay, I will recognize you for your amendment. We'll ask you to describe the amendment for up to 3 minutes. And then after the conclusion of it, I will ask for a second. Commissioner Kay, you may go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment that has been distributed both previously and again is being distributed. It's a single page, and it's just seeking to add some clarification to the preamble language. 2 points, basically. It's simply intended to clarify that the consistent thresholds for regulation that was used by the CHAP and the Commission has been and remains a hazard index greater than 1. And the amendment also clarifies that the relevant data continues to show that there are still actual women of a reproductive age that have a hazard index greater than 1.
Is there a second? Second. Having heard a second, we will now move to consideration of Commissioner Kay's amendment. Commissioners will ask their questions, and then we'll come back to Commissioner Kay at the end, unless any of the commissioners want to yield their time to Commissioner Kay during the course of their 5 minutes. Each commissioner will have 5 minutes, and we can have multiple rounds if necessary. I do not have any questions for Commissioner Kay. Commissioner Adler?
More of a comment than a question. I particularly like your language on page 89, line 6, in which you note that there is no threshold for recommendations or regulatory proposals. We've heard a number of comments about the 95th percentile, which as though that were some magic number, and I think what you've done clarifies that particularly well, so I want to commend you for that. But I guess that's more of a comment than a question.
Thank you. Commissioner Robinson.
I don't have any questions. I do have a couple comments, and I want to thank you for this amendment, which I fully support. I think it's well for all of us to remember that CHAP, for very good reasons, did not rely on NHANES data on women of reproductive age, given that they had better data from the Study for Future Families for Children and Infants and from the 2005-2006 NHANES cycle that focused on pregnant women. Since the population we're charged with protecting by Congress is fetuses, infants, and young children, the best data are those that relate directly to that population, and the next best are pregnant women. It makes no sense to take data 2 steps removed from the relevant population and argue that we should rely only on these data to pass a rule that would ensure reasonable certainty of no harm with an adequate margin of safety to the relevant population. Further, even using this surrogate of women of reproductive age, the CHAP determined that if the hazard quotient for each phthalate and the hazard index for the cumulative risk are greater than 1, adverse effects are possible. The CHAP and staff analyses of the risk were not based on percentiles as a bright line for risk management purposes, particularly a percentile of a surrogate for the population we are to protect. And so I thank you for making these amendments. Staff made it abundantly clear that the objective was to identify anyone at risk, not what proportion of the population was at risk. The charge from Congress was to ascertain a reasonable certainty of no harm. Ensuring reasonable certainty of no harm with an adequate margin of safety cannot mean focusing on data from surrogate populations, ascertain how many people in that removed population could be left at risk, and use these data to permit the renewed use of anti-androgenic phthalates in children's toys and child care articles, although Commissioner Mohorovic seemed to be advocating this flawed approach in his line of questioning at the briefing last week. For these reasons, I support this amendment.
Thank you, Commissioner Robinson. Commissioner Mohorovic.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Commissioner Kay, I do have questions. First, to start with the very purposeful qualification of individuals and women throughout. I only mentioned this briefly before we began the hearing, but there is about 1, 2, 3, almost 10 instances where women are qualified as actual women, and you seem to go through great pains to define that. And I wanted to understand better, what is that distinction wherever the use of the word women, where you felt compelled to amend the Federal Registry 10 times to clarify that they are actual women or actual women of reproductive age. Can you help me understand why the purpose of that?
Sure, happy to answer that. It came out of, in large part, the line of questionings that occurred during the briefing, where I think sometimes the lines got blurred between what are statistical projections and theoretical projections and what are a result of true people, that there are people out there who had, through their NHANES testing, had shown these levels of exposure. And I thought it was important just to remember that there are people that, or at least they were walking around during that time, who had that level of exposure as opposed to a theoretical projection of people.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Mohorovic. Commissioner Kay, do you have anything you would like to add to your amendment?
Nothing further. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Having heard no further questions to Commissioner Kay's amendment, we will vote. We will move to vote on the amendment. Commissioner Adler, how do you vote?
I vote aye.
Commissioner Robinson?
Aye.
Commissioner Kay?
Aye.
Commissioner Mohorovic?
Aye.
And I vote no. The yeas are 4 and the nays are 1. The amendment by Commissioner Kay has been approved. Are there any other additional amendments or motions this morning? Having heard no further amendments or motions, we will now turn to the consideration of the final rule, Prohibition of Children's Toys and Child Care Articles containing specified phthalates as amended. Each commissioner will have up to 10 minutes for closing remarks after the conclusion of all of our votes this morning. But on this issue, does anyone else wish to be heard before we take a vote on the final rule? Commissioner Adler?
No, not at this time.
Commissioner Robinson?
No.
Commissioner Kay?
No.
Commissioner Mohorovic?
No.
Having heard no further comments, we will now call the vote. Again, this vote is to adopt the final rule, Prohibition of Children's Toys and Child Care Articles containing specified phthalates as amended, and to promulgate it into the Federal Register. Commissioner Adler, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Robinson?
Aye.
Commissioner Kay?
Aye.
Commissioner Mohorovic?
No.
And I vote no. The yeas are 3 and the nays are 2. The final rule, the Prohibition of Children's Toys and Child Care Articles containing specified phthalates as amended, has been adopted and approved for publication in the Federal Register. We will now turn to the second matter before us this morning, and that is to consider the notion of proposed rulemaking, a revision to the Notice of Requirements for Prohibitions of Children's Toys and Child Care Articles containing specified phthalates. Does anyone have any amendments or motions with regards to this proposal? Commissioner Adler? Commissioner Robinson? Commissioner Kay?
Nope.
Commissioner Mohorovic? Having heard no proposed amendments or motions, we will now vote on the adoption of the notice to propose rulemaking, revision to the notice of requirements for the prohibition of children's toys and child care articles containing specified phthalates, and the publication in the Federal Register. Again, we will have time for closing remarks following this vote. But does anyone wish to be heard on this matter? Commissioner Adler?
No.
Commissioner Robinson? Commissioner Kay?
No.
Commissioner Mohorovic? Having heard no further comments, we will call the vote. Commissioner Adler, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Robinson?
Aye.
Commissioner Kay?
Aye.
Commissioner Mohorovic?
Aye.
And I vote aye. The ayes are 5, the nays are 0. The ayes have it. We will now turn to our closing statements. Each commissioner will have up to 10 minutes for their closing statement, and I will begin with my closing statement. The Commission's final rule on phthalates represents the culmination of a huge effort spanning almost a decade. I want to thank the CPSC staff for their enormous contribution to this matter. The technical staffs not only assisted the CHAP in developing the report that is the primary basis for this rule, but also analyzed a great deal of scientific data, particularly exposure data, that was not addressed in the CHAP report. Our staff also reviewed and responded to more than 100 public comments, many of which involved highly technical points. The staff briefing package is voluminous, but it is well organized and it addresses a wide range of issues. I also want to recognize and thank the Office of General Counsel for their many contributions in this matter. In particular, I found the legal memo to be very helpful in sorting through the many challenging legal questions arising under Section 108 of CPSIA as well as other statutes. I believe that we should have lifted the interim prohibition on DINP. In my view, the scientific evidence does not support the decision to make the interim prohibition permanent. Expanding the scope of the prohibition is even less justified. I intend to write a written statement discussing my positions in detail, but for now I will simply summarize some of the main points. The argument for making DINP prohibition permanent is based on the CHAP's cumulative risk assessment, as updated by the CPSC staffs with later exposure data. Let me begin by observing that the later biomonitoring data has completely transformed the risk picture, whereas the original CHAP assessment found as many as 10% of pregnant women at risk based on the outdated 2005-2006 data. The updated assessment, when using the newer NHANES data, showed that the risk has declined dramatically, not only at the median level, but even more so at the extremes. In the staff's assessment of the more recent data, we are now talking about a few individual women with a calculated hazard risk index above 1. The exact number depends on which potency estimates are examined, an issue that I will return to in a minute. But it's crucial to recognize, and I want to say this for emphasis, but it is crucial to recognize that not one of these women was pregnant when their samples were taken. The Commission has lost sight of this point in the transition from the outdated NHANES data to the newer sets. There's nothing wrong with using women of reproductive age as a proxy for the exposure of pregnant women. I agree that doing so was appropriate. But when you do that, you have to remember why the CHAP was looking at pregnant women in the first place. It is not the pregnant women who are at risk. The hazard index is not about them. The risk we are calculating is present only if a pregnant woman is carrying a male fetus during the roughly 6-week period when their reproductive system is developing. This would be true of only a small fraction of the women of reproductive age. Since none of the women in the staff's analysis of the later NHANES data is pregnant, the cumulative risk assessment is actually showing no one is at risk, even the few individuals in the high estimated exposures. For this reason, I believe that staff's analysis of the later data shows a reasonable certainty of no harm from lifting the interim prohibition on DINP. In my view, the staff should have made other adjustments in updating the CHAP's cumulative risk analysis as well. The public comments give several reasons why the phthalate exposures are overestimated. The newer NHANES data sets contains additional types of information that the CHAP did not have at its disposal. The comments show that if this new information had been used, it would have yielded significantly lower estimates, at least for some DEHP metabolites. Another commenter pointed out that the CHAP failed to include both metabolites of DINP in its own exposure estimates. They show that if all the available NHANES data had been used, the results would have been a 17% lower DINP exposure. The other major exposure issue involves the use of spot samples. There's nothing wrong with using these samples to develop exposure estimates. The problem lies in using these spot samples as if they represent long-term exposure. CDC researchers have studied this issue carefully in as much as it has great significance to the NHANES design. They found that spot samples overestimate 24-hour exposures by about 30% and weekly exposures by much more. Another major problem with the CHAP's analysis is the use of 3 different potency estimates for the cumulative risk assessment. These are referred to as case 1, 2, and 3. All of these are based exclusively on rat studies, and all of them are conservative. Each of these has problems, but case 2 is particularly indefensible, unfortunately, has been carried forward in the staff's updated cumulative risk assessment. Case 2 develops a purely theoretical, no-effect level for DINP based on 2 misguided ingredients. The problem with case 2 is that this theoretical no-effect level for DINP is refuted by scientific evidence. Case 3, which reflects the CHAP's own review of the scientific literature, uses a value almost 4 times higher as the point of departure for DINP. There's no empirical basis for setting a lower level, it's just an unfounded assumption. The staff points out that the CHAP developed 3 different cases because it wanted to test the sensitivity of these assumptions. There's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't justify the Commission relying on these 3 inconsistent analyses at this point. If the Commission does not agree with the CHAP's own analysis of the science as reflected in Case 3, or it actually credits Case 2 for some reason, it should say so. But holding up 3 inconsistent analyses and hoping that there is an answer in there somewhere is not reasoned decision-making. It's a regulatory shell game. In addition to its cumulative risk assessment based on the exposures of pregnant women, the CHAP also made an assessment based on estimated exposures of young children under 30 months of age. Unfortunately, none of the NHANES data sets contain biomonitoring data on children under 6 years old. The CHAP therefore turned to some very limited biomonitoring data from the Studies for Future Families, referred to as SFF. Unlike the NHANES biomonitoring data, the SFF data are not the result of any national sampling protocol. Thus, they are not even arguably representative of a national exposure. The SFF data were collected in 1999 to 2005, and therefore are even older than the obsolete NHANES data originally used by the CHAP to estimate exposure of pregnant women. Given what we know now about the trends of phthalate exposures from the later NHANES data, I really don't see how the outdated SFF data could be used to make any valid regulatory decision here in 2017. Besides making the interim prohibition on DINP permanent, the Commission majority also voted to expand the scope of the prohibition to a broader class of toys. While the interim prohibition applies only to any children's toys that can be placed in the mouth, the Commission's action extends the permanent prohibition to all children's toys. The staff's rationale for expanding the scope of the prohibition amounts to nothing more than the observation that a child's exposure to phthalates can also result from handling or licking toys without placing them in their mouth. The staff makes no attempt to quantify what additional exposure might occur through these pathways. The expansion is not even limited to toys that are intended for children under 30 months of age or under 4 years of age. the age applicable to child care articles, or any other age for that matter. In my view, these arguments fall short of what should be needed to justify this expansion of the prohibition. In sum, I believe that the Commission should have lifted the interim ban and prohibition on DINP. I'm confident that in doing so, we could have reasonably been certain of no harm to the vulnerable populations with an ample margin of safety. Before closing, I also want to note, even though I disagree with a portion of the CHAP's reasoning and their recommendations, their work here underscores why the Commission's recent guidance document on organohalogen flame retardants was so inappropriate. There are many similarities in structure between different phthalates, yet the CHAP did not treat them all the same. It examined the scientific evidence on each one before making any decisions. It recommended lifting the interim prohibitions for some phthalates, subjecting other phthalates to regulation for the first time. The class of organohalogens is immensely larger than this class of phthalates. It consists of many different subclasses with structures that differ far more than do the phthalates considered here by the CHAP. Yet my colleagues decided to condemn them all before hearing from the CHAP that will consider the evidence. Thank you very much, Commissioner Adler.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and thank you for reading that statement. I very much look forward to reading your more detailed technical statement and to responding to it. As I was listening to your comments, and I didn't follow every single one of them, but I was sort of mentally checking off what I read in the staff briefing package, and I honestly believe that the staff addressed the comments that you've raised and I think answered them very thoughtfully. But again, I look forward to the continued debate. I again want to thank this incredibly talented staff for their many days, months, and years of hard work in analyzing a massive amount of data and making a number of extremely thoughtful recommendations to us. Your dedication to this task has been exemplary, and I want you to know how grateful I am. More importantly, I want you to know how grateful the families in the United States would be if they but knew how hard you have worked and how careful you have been in producing the recommendations before us. As usual, they mostly don't know, so it falls on us to speak on their behalf. So on their behalf, again, I thank you. I also want to thank the many stakeholders who've weighed in on this issue, including consumer groups and public health groups. In passing, because we are discussing DINP, I note that I had numerous meetings with a highly professional group of scientists from ExxonMobil who patiently explained their company's perspective on phthalates, as I say, most particularly DINP. I just want to say I listened as carefully and openly as I could to these presentations. The fact that I've reached a different conclusion doesn't mean that I didn't hear the arguments, nor that I ignored the analysis. It means that I look at the policy implications of the data before the Commission differently. Our vote today represents a major milestone in a process that was started many years ago, at least back to the 1980s, when serious concerns were first raised about the potential health effects of phthalates. In fact, when I left the CPSC in 1984, the agency was in the early stages of grappling with phthalate hazards. And over the years, we've seen sporadic efforts to understand and address the full dimension of the health effects of these chemicals. So it was with mixed feelings when I returned to the CPSC in 2009, I saw that phthalates remained and will continue to remain a matter of concern. To my delight, I saw that Congress had just taken a giant and much-needed step in 2008 with the passage of Section 108 of the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act. Section 108 banned phthalates in children's toys and child care articles and imposed an interim ban on others with a general direction for us to evaluate the health effects of all phthalates in children's products. So pursuant to this direction, we convened a chronic hazard advisory panel, a CHAP, to study phthalates and phthalate alternatives. I believe the CHAP's review and the staff's further analysis have brought the health and safety issues into clear focus, and I commend both the CHAP and our staff for such excellent work. I'm particularly delighted that Congress adopted a comprehensive approach to addressing phthalate hazards, rather than a piecemeal, one-by-one, whack-a-mole plan that merely sets the stage for what has come to be known as regrettable substitution of one hazardous chemical for another. Turning to the specific vote before us, my starting point is the statute that guides our decision-making. As we all know, Section 108 of CPSIA requires the Commission to make its decision about whether or not to ban certain phthalates on our determination whether a ban is needed, quote, in order to ensure a reasonable certainty of no harm to children, pregnant women, or other susceptible individuals with an adequate margin of safety. So, as with any good lawyer, I try to parse this legal standard, and I looked at two separate phrases. The first is whether we can make a safety determination on phthalates with reasonable certainty. Based on the evidence before us in the briefing package, I believe there is reasonable certainty regarding the data on phthalates. Staff has made a compelling case that the risk based on the hazard index of actual women of reproductive age is a small but significant real concrete number. More importantly, based on this risk, it's almost inescapable that fetuses and infants are at even greater risk. The second phrase is no harm to children, pregnant women, or other susceptible individuals. As I read these words, we're not directed to make a finding that any particular phthalate presents a significant but reasonable amount of harm in order to act. We must find no harm. You might ask yourselves, why would Congress impose such a stringent standard for rulemaking? And I think there's a simple but compelling answer to this question. Simply put, if we cannot make a finding of reasonable certainty of no harm, by implication we're making a determination there is a reasonable certainty of harm. And unlike other types of harm, such as paper cuts, upset stomachs, or bruises, harm from phthalates is almost never trivial. When a child is harmed by phthalates, the harm is likely to be serious and life-altering. So when I reflect on the legal test that Congress imposed on CPSC, I see that they intend us to walk the extra mile to protect our most vulnerable citizens from extremely serious harm, a proposition with which I am in complete agreement. I think the toughest decision for us is about DINP. I think the chairman's right about that. Clearly, in terms of susceptible populations, it is a less potent chemical than DEHP. But the problem is it still presents anti-androgenic effects, and its growing replacement for DEHP leads to a staff finding that DINP now contributes roughly as much as DEHP to cumulative risk. In short, merely because there is a reduced risk does not mean that it is an acceptable risk, and it certainly doesn't mean no risk or no harm. And here, I want to thank Congress for its direction in Section 108 for us to consider the potential health effects of each phthalate not only in isolation but also in combination with other phthalates, and to consider the cumulative effect of total exposure to phthalates. This direction helps us avoid a tragedy of the commons dilemma where we look only to the individual impact of each phthalate but ignore the total health risk from permitting harm upon harm. One final thought. Today's vote represents yet another action taken by CPSC to address the challenges of chronic hazards in consumer products. I must say how proud I am of CPSC staff and my colleagues for how effectively we've addressed these challenges given how modest our resources are. I doubt that when Congress established our agency, anyone was seriously thinking of these risks as part of our portfolio. It really traces back to TRIS. And I'm greatly concerned that more and more of these risks are coming our way with no added funding to address them. So it is my profound hope that once the budget-cutting, regulation-bashing madness that I see in Washington these days passes, that we will be able to give the proper attention to protecting our most vulnerable citizens that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Adler. Commissioner Robinson.
As we all know, this arriving at this final rule has been an extremely long process. To really get the full picture of the process, I think we need to go back to that long ago time of 2008 when there was much discussion in the scientific communities in the U.S. and abroad about the potential dangers of phthalates to our children. Clearly, Congress was responding to those discussions when it almost unanimously passed a progressive measure like Section 108 of CPSIA, which allowed the CPSC to address phthalates using an approach that was both very protective of our children and removing many of the hoops CPSC would have had to jump through to address phthalates through FHSA. Congress clearly envisioned this process moving quickly. It directed the appointment of the CHAP that would study the effects on children's health of all phthalates and phthalate alternatives used in children's toys and child care articles, and then within 180 days of completing that study, they would give us a report, and within 180 days of getting the report, we would issue our final rule. Here we are 9 years later, passing a final rule protecting our youngest consumers from potentially dangerous phthalates. We're here today after NRDC sued the CPSC to ensure that the CPSC fulfilled its congressional mandate, finally, to reach a decision on this rule. While that suit forced the CPSC to finally arrive at a decision, the suit and the consent order that was entered by the judge certainly did not rush a decision in any way and did not force a specific decision. There's nothing about our action today that anyone could argue seriously is premature. I've known about and studied the phthalates issue before this commission since my Senate confirmation hearing more than 5 years ago, and certainly for the entire 4+ years I've served as a commissioner. The truth of the matter is, in my view, that this process has taken so very long in large part because of the intense lobbying by Exxon and its representatives to try to keep us from permanently banning its phthalate DINP, which Congress banned on an interim basis in 2008 in toys that can be placed in a child's mouth and child care products. DINP has clearly been a very lucrative phthalate used in other products in recent years as the substitute for the much more potent DEHP. This growth in the sales of DINP is evidenced by the fact that the latest biomonitoring data from NHANES shows that the amount of DINP in adult women of reproductive age has grown exponentially in recent years, indeed 5-fold. I and my fellow commissioners have spent many hours meeting multiple people from Exxon and its affiliates on multiple occasions over many years, and they have informed us of their views at each step of this process. They've also participated very actively in the CHAP process, met on multiple occasions with our CPSC scientists to articulate their views. The vast majority, if not all, of the over 100 comments of those that were critical of the CHAP's approach and conclusions came from industry or industry-sponsored organizations. For example, the American Chemistry Council put together a panel review of scientists hired by industry and not subject to the NAS strict conflict of interest rules. All of this participation by Exxon is very much a great part of our American government. And my staff and I and my fellow commissioners, I'm sure this was true of them as well, we've prepared carefully for and listened very closely to each presentation. And I'm sure that was true of the members of CHAP and our staff as well. But another great part of our system, at least as it was and at the moment still is at the CPSC, is that we listen to scientists and not lobbyists. I want to both thank and commend our Chronic Hazard Advisory Panel and the peer reviewers who are nominated by the National Academy of Sciences and subject to specific conflict of interest requirements, and I want to thank the scientists on our staff. These disinterested scientists spent years of their lives studying the issues in this case. I'm impressed that at every step of this process, the conclusions of the scientists have been based on the best available peer-reviewed science from those with no conflict of interest and on supporting studies conducted in accordance with sound, objective scientific practices. As I reviewed the 109 comments submitted and the responses from our scientists, I was so impressed that at every step, the CPSC response was based soundly on science. I'm delighted that a majority of the commissioners listened closely, studied the issues, and at the end of the day decided that our assignment from Congress to protect our most vulnerable young consumers dictated that we make the decision we did today. The products with which we are dealing are only children's toys and child care articles. It's really important to remember that. The population we are protecting are 2 to 3 times more vulnerable to phthalates than we are as adults. The phthalates we are banning today are all anti-androgenic, so individually or in combination with other phthalates, they can cause adverse effects on the male reproductive organs. There is so little we can do to protect our children from dangerous chemicals today, but we are making a decision today to do what we can within our jurisdiction. We can keep anti-androgenic phthalates from being added to our children's toys and child care articles. To vote against this rule and let these anti-androgenic phthalates, even DINP, be used in toys and child care articles flies in the face of all independent scientific advice before us. It is contrary to the advice of CHAP, the National Research Council, the Peer Review Committee, and the scientists on our staff. A vote against this rule is a vote purely in favor of the industry scientists and to let industry expose our most vulnerable consumers to lifelong effects on their reproductive organs. The mandate we received from Congress was very protective. And we have to remember that Section 108, the CPSIA, was passed in the House 424-1 and 89-3 in the Senate. The words of that statute should be taken very carefully. And those words, which have been discussed so much both today and throughout the last 9 years, of ensuring a reasonable certainty of no harm to children, and the words necessary to protect the health of children, I take very seriously. This process has been very thorough. The CHAP made an extraordinary effort. These were premier scientists with no conflict of interest. They had 7 public meetings, 6 teleconferences. They invited experts, some who found things that they were troubled might be contrary to what they ended up concluding. They invited them to participate in the process. The CPSIA did not require that the CHAP have a peer review, but they asked for a peer review, again from disinterested science, and did not give us the final report until it had been peer reviewed. The CPSC has followed a robust, thorough, and participatory process. The NPR is a thorough package. We received over 100 comments, and they were very carefully analyzed. If we break down our decision making, the products we're regulating, children's toys and child care products. The population are infants and young children whom we're protecting. The danger is that the effect of anti-androgenic phthalates individually or in combination will affect the reproductive abilities of our boy children. We know that all the phthalates we're banning today, including DINP, are anti-androgenic, and those we are not banning are not. It's quite simple. If we look at the fact that we were, Commissioner Adler addressed this point very carefully about how wonderful it is that Congress told us to look at the cumulative effects, and that's what we've done. The biometric measures that we have from before the ban on phthalates are the most direct of children, which I've mentioned. The next most direct are of pregnant women, and finally, the 3 steps out or 2 steps out, depending on how you count, are the ones on women of reproductive age. To say that this later data completely transformed the risk is based on fatally flawed logic. And it makes no sense that that's the data that we would decide on, based on that we would decide to add these dangerous phthalates into our children's products. I'm proud today to vote to ban in children's toys and child care products anything over 0.1% of DINP along with the other chemicals we are banning. And let me say that I want to make sure that our chair understands that all we did with organohalogens is ask our scientists to give us an opinion. We did not condemn a class. We asked for science, something that we're following today, and I proudly vote in favor of this ban.
Commissioner Kay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One would think that no society would ever tolerate a system where its citizens, especially its youngest children, are used as guinea pigs to determine if they are being poisoned every day by chemicals in their food, their homes, and their household products. But that is exactly how it works in our country when it comes to chemical management. Our public policy in this area consists of all of us, especially our children, blindly being exposed each day to scores of chemicals, both individually but more often in combinations, and without any certainty that these chemicals are not causing cancer in adults, are not preventing women from having children, and are not causing children to suffer intellectual and developmental delays. And the effects are not just felt on an individual basis. Credible concerns have been raised that some violent behavior and its effects on and costs to society might in part be caused by exposure to certain chemicals that impair the brain. The prevalence of chemical exposures is believed to be at least partially responsible for the explosion of certain chronic diseases and adverse health effects across society. The impacts on our bodies and our healthcare system are far from insignificant. In an exceedingly rare and overwhelmingly bipartisan way, Congress stepped into this sad state of affairs in 2008. Congress directed our agency, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, to convene a panel of the world's top scientists to study phthalates as a group of chemicals of high concern, and directed us, based on the panel's findings, as necessary to protect us all, especially the most vulnerable among us. Phthalates are ubiquitous in our society because they are mostly used to soften plastic. The science around these chemicals had matured to the point where Congress felt compelled to outright ban 3 of them immediately, place an interim ban on 3 more, and charge us with studying and acting on those phthalates and phthalate alternatives that harm the public. There were at least 3 strong health protective provisions in the related section of the law that Congress passed. First, the scientific panel was charged to look not only at the impact of chemicals in isolation, but also as mixtures through a cumulative risk assessment. This direction, of course, made sense since we were all exposed in real time not just to a single chemical, but actually to cocktails of them. Second, Congress said we should draw the safety line in a place where we felt there was a, quote, reasonable certainty of no harm to children, pregnant women, or other susceptible individuals with an adequate margin of safety, end quote. In other words, Congress clearly instructed us to err on the side of being extremely health protective, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable among us. Third, Congress sought to avoid what is called regrettable substitution by having the panel of scientists consider phthalates and phthalate alternatives with the hope that any resulting regulatory action would not just take away one harmful chemical to have it replaced by another. 9 years later, we are finally fulfilling the congressional vision toward a slightly saner, more rational, and certainly more health protective system, at least with respect to this one type of chemical. After all the strong and compelling scientific work put into it, our decision today should have come with unanimous support. Sadly, it did not. I find that all the more curious because no one among us is immune to the effect of these chemicals. We all have families and friends that we would do anything to protect, except, it seems, when it comes to chemicals. Even when Congress spoke so clearly about the need to protect infants, children, pregnant women, and the rest of us, there was inexplicable opposition here at the Commission, and there will very likely be judicial review down the line. On that point, I would like to speak for a moment. More specifically, I would like to speak to the judges, potentially justices, and law clerks who may look over this record and make a final determination. First, please see how specific Congress was in the statute with its charge, how highly protective of the health and safety of vulnerable populations in a preventative way the standard it established is, and how that differs from our other statutes in a meaningful way. Second, please note the fidelity with which the panel of independent scientific experts, known as the CHAP, followed congressional and commission direction, how thorough the CHAP was, and how its methods and conclusions were validated by a substantial and independent peer review. Next, please observe how carefully the Commission and its staff reviewed the scientific report, as well as the public comments at each stage of the rulemaking, and how this effort and the analysis included the latest and most credible and relevant scientific data available. And finally, please look to the actual science and the way the CHAP and the Commission relied on that science and the valid scientific methodologies to address points raised at each step of the process. Some of those points were valid, some appear less so. Regardless, each was addressed with great care and broad support throughout the rulemaking record. I want to express my gratitude to our expert staff for their tremendous work on this rulemaking, as well as to all the independent scientific experts who served on the chat, who did the peer review, and all those stakeholders who took the time to provide comments throughout this rulemaking process. This safety effort was years in the making, and the results served the public health very well. The result is also 100% consistent with the direction from Congress. The only policy limitation is that the process unfortunately addresses just a part of one group of chemicals. That is due to the lack of investment in the science necessary to find answers sooner. Meanwhile, we still allow ourselves, our families, and our friends to be poisoned each day by numerous other chemicals before we slowly act. None of us is well served by such a system, and we are all paying for it one way or another. Even though the Commission has just approved this rule, today was sadly not the day for all of us to join together for a safer and better world for our children. Hopefully tomorrow will be.
Commissioner Mohorovic.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First of all, I'd like to associate myself with all of the compliments voiced by my colleagues very eloquently to and paid to the dozens, if not hundreds, who have contributed to this effort, especially, of course, our CPSC staff for the excellent job, but also, as I think Commissioner Adler mentioned, the external stakeholders for helping inform this process. I have a written statement on this particular matter that interested parties may refer to, but I'll be taking this time to make an announcement of a different nature. This afternoon, I'll be tendering my resignation to the President, effective close of business on Friday. On Monday, I'll be joining Denton's, the biggest of big law, as a principal in the firm's federal regulatory and compliance practice. I'll be based out of the firm's Chicago and Washington offices. I chose Denton's because of the opportunity to become part of a well-known and respected global law firm with a world-class product safety team, offering best-in-class representation over the full life cycle of a consumer product, from proactive guidance on compliance and supply chain interruption to state and federal regulatory counseling, all the way through product liability defense and dispute resolutions. Denton's product safety practice spans the globe, with more than 25 professionals practicing in the product safety regulatory space and dozens of product liability litigators, many of whom you know very well, including incoming ICFSO President Belinda May and Jim Manley, both very accomplished attorneys in the product safety world. With 2 years left in my term, the timing of my departure might come as a surprise to some. But I'd like to share with everyone a card that that I received from my daughter, who wrote earlier this year. There's a good shot of it. So, written, "Dear Dad, happy birthday. I love you so much. Even though we don't get to see each other very often, but you always come back and make us happy. Love, Lucy." So when you get a note like that, you realize it's time. So public service is both an honor and a sacrifice. And it's a sacrifice not just for those who serve, but their families as well. That's why I want to thank my wife, Royale, for hers. We celebrated 13 wonderful years of marriage on Monday, but could only do so over coffee, as I had to make my way out to stand my post at the commission. And to my daughters, Gigi, Lucy, and Stevie. The last 3 years have been difficult for them as well, but I hope this experience will help them appreciate the importance of giving back to their community and finding their own answer to JFK's great challenge. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I want to, of course, thank all of the dedicated civil servants I've had the pleasure to work with in this, my second time at the CPSC. I have the utmost appreciation and admiration for the zeal with which CPSC staff go about their duties in the furtherance of consumer product safety. And thanks to all the politicals, especially those who have supported me in my office, Bryce Dustman, Mike Gentine, Ryan Radford, and now Charlene Swartz McGowan, who will be joining Chairman Burkle's staff upon my departure. And now a few remarks towards my colleagues on the commission. Commissioner Robinson, thanks for collaborating with me on the hazard of furniture tip-over. Commissioner Kay, I want to voice my appreciation for the exemplary workplace dynamic among commissioners that I largely attribute to your leadership, both as chairman, but also now as commissioner. From our first conversation, you identified this as a priority, and you led by example. Relatedly, I have always greatly admired your poise. You are truly unflappable, and we both know I've tried to flap you over the years, and always unsuccessfully. So remind me to never play poker with you. Commissioner Adler, my friend and colleague, thank you for the hours we've spent together discussing product safety challenges. You earnestly listened to alternatives and differing points of view, as you mentioned in your comments today. It's at this point, Bob, that I'm going to have to pause because Charlene warned that I was going to start to gush. So I'm going to read the compliments I paid, but you're going to only have to choose one because I maybe have gone over the top. So the first one is, to me, you're the very embodiment of this institution. That's choice one. Choice two, if we were in the business of naming CPSC buildings, your name should be first. You are included on everyone's Mount Rushmore list of great CPSC commissioners, but that's only puts you in the top 4, so you might not jump on 3. Or you're simply the CPSC GOAT, the greatest of all time. So I don't know, do you want 1 through 4?
You're going to make me start crying, so I think I'll just remain silent.
See, this is a typical Bob judo move. You even took it up another notch with more humility, even beyond the compliments that I paid you. Checkmate, my friend. Madam Chairman, this agency is in your very capable hands. The President made an outstanding choice in asking you to serve as chairman. You are an inspiration and beloved by your colleagues. None more so than me. And in your 6 months or so at the reins, I have stood in awe of your leadership and effectiveness that you have demonstrated. Truly in awe. I'm so proud to have served with you. In conclusion, this agency, we all know, will very soon embark on 7 years of Republican leadership. This will go through this presidency, and it'll go all the way to the 2024 election, no matter who wins the 2020 election. So with this in mind, it's my hope that the new majority resists the urge to do unto others as they have had done to them, because tyranny of the majority is still tyranny, whether it's at the hands of Democratic or Republican rule. And I firmly believe that this has kept CPSC from fulfilling its full potential for the American consumer. And hyperpartisanship in Washington, D.C. proves every day how disastrous it is for sound public policy. So I want to encourage my colleagues here today and those who will come after me to fight for that consensus position that's always right in front of us, but all too often, frustratingly, just out of reach. Because I believe it's the consensus bipartisan approaches and solutions that are the most effective, enduring, and in the best interests of all Americans. Thank you, and God bless America.
Thank you, Commissioner Mohorovic. Let me say again thank you to all of our staff today for all of their work on this package, including those who presented today, and thank you to the Office of Secretary, Office of the Executive Director, our General Counsel, Mary Boyle, John McGugan, who is our audiovisual specialist, for facilitating the hearing. Also, thank you to all of our staffs, our personal office staffs. These kinds of packages create a lot of work for them, and I know I express all of our appreciation to our staff. And lastly, Commissioner Morhovic, I know I speak for my colleagues, our best wishes to you. Thank you for your service to this agency, and your wit, your humor, and your intelligence will all greatly be missed. It concludes the public hearing of the Consumer Product Safety Commission.